Hello, this is your host, Lewis, the Praise of Flight podcast. Today is episode 100 of the Casual Stream, entitled The Scientific Study of Power. This is related to last week's show, which dealt with power more in a relational position, so how it relates to you, the individual. This is a little different. This is about how power is used and understood, and specifically, given the title, how power was understood first scientifically. So without much further, and we see in the chat here, we have not Salmonfish and GF. Hello, everyone. Glad to see you here. Now, without much further ado, we will begin. Last week, we discussed the nature of an individual's relationship to power. Today, we will discuss how power is to be studied scientifically and look at how in the use of power in an institutional sense, which forms of power are most fundamental and how they relate to each other. It's not intended to be exhaustive by any means, but a detailed introduction to the topic. The scientific study of power in the West begins with Machiavelli and his The Prince, published in 1513. What makes Machiavelli scientific is his commitment to politics as it is, rather than as we should wish it to be. In chapter 15 of The Prince we read, But since my aim was to write something useful for anyone interested, I felt it would be appropriate to go to the real truth of the matter, not to repeat other people's fantasies. Many writers have dreamed up republics and kingdoms that bear no resemblance to experience and never existed in reality. There is such a gap between how people actually live and how they ought to live that anyone who declines to behave as people do in order to behave as they should is schooling himself for catastrophe and had better forget personal security. If you always want to play the good man in a world where most people are not good, you'll end up badly. Hence, if a ruler wants to survive, he will have to learn to stop being good, at least when the occasion demands. This encapsulates Machiavelli's conception of the political. Look at things as they are, not as we would wish them to be. Be pragmatic, and when the affairs of state demand it, do the morally wrong thing, but politically justifiable thing. We can couple this with his statement on being good in chapter 18. There is nothing more important than appearing to be religious. Machiavelli is arguing that people never see you for who you are and care more about your appearance than the results of your actions, that your true self or pure motives. He argues that a prince ought to appear good and yet be willing to perform acts that are morally wicked if they are demanded by the state. Tied into this theory of governance is a whole series of practical observations that we also find in the discourses on Livy, the art of war, and the Florentine histories. Many of Machiavelli's practical observations are true and hold up over time. These observations include the idea that unitary states are hard to conquer but easy to rule, that divided states are easy to conquer but hard to rule, political freedom is proportional to the level of arms a populace is able to possess, fortune favors the bold, and many theories and stratagems on the use of the direct application of force in war and internal security for the state. Machiavelli is, in many regards, the first scientific man. Roger Bacon, the father of the scientific method, states in his The Advancement of Learning, so that we are much beholden to Machiavelli and others that write what men do and not what they ought to do. Machiavelli's theory of power, as seen on The Prince, can be summarized in three big ideas. See things as they are. Appearance is superior to the reality of things. As Mao would say centuries later, power grows out of the barrel of a gun. For Machiavelli, correct political action can only occur within the framework of seeing men as they are and understanding how they act, rather than as moralists might wish they act. Machiavelli agrees with Sun Tzu that all warfare is based on deception. By masking his true intentions, the prince is able to act without his actions being discerned or countered. Machiavelli takes the view that physical force is the true source of power and that a prince ought to use it judiciously to preserve his power. He cannot come out and say this, so the appearance of being good is essential. In the state of saying, instead of saying, I am using my army to squash an uprising to secure my power, he might say, these heretics are in defiance of Rome and I will destroy them for the good of Christendom. The church isn't going to call him out, especially if she gains by the acquisition of goods and property, and the prince is able to remove his enemy. The problem here is the signal drift that develops. No matter how clever a schemer, he cannot keep all the balls juggling in the air without them dropping to the ground. Such a method runs the risk of creating a realm of total fantasy that the prince lives in and brings down his fall. When it comes to the practical application of force, Machiavelli, at the cusp of the gunpowder revolution, struggles to see how this change affects his theory of power. Machiavelli is therefore a believer in the cult of overwhelming force. Machiavelli naturally sees the ancient Roman Republic as an example of the power of a unified Italy, and his force-centric approach is rooted in the belief that the state will have overwhelming manpower reserves, as did classical Rome. Strategies of attrition and total war work under such conditions, but most states do not have these resources, and the backlash is that Rome's population ended up plummeting after centuries of attrition warfare. As J.F.C. Fuller states in his Julius Caesar, Man, Soldier, Tyrant, of the many changes provoked by expansion, the most serious was the steady decline of the farming population in Italy. Since the landless city rabble and the slaves were not conscripted, it was the sole source of recruitment, and unless the number of the legions could keep pace with the demands of expansion, their wastage be made good, the whole structure of the republic was in peril of collapse. A friend of Machiavelli, Francesco Guicciardini, criticized Machiavelli's force-centric approach. Violent remedies, though they make one safe from one aspect, yet from another involve all kinds of weaknesses. Hence, the prince must take courage to use these extraordinary means when necessary, and yet take care not to miss any change which offers of establishing his cause with humanity, kindness, and rewards, not taking as an absolute rule what Machiavelli says, who was always extremely partial to extraordinary and violent methods. Suffice all this is to say that violence and the direct application of physical force is expensive, not just in the energy that is consumed to prepare and use it, but also in terms of the blowback that results. Blowback is a technical term that means the unexpected results of an action, usually the result of some direct action. In short, we can summarize Machiavelli into two basic themes: the descriptive claim of things as they are, and the prescriptive claim of what you ought to do with this knowledge. Machiavelli argues you should use this knowledge to your personal advantage to gain leverage over people, to secure your power and fulfill your will. I reject this notion and argue that contextualized within Christ's dictum, therefore be wise as serpents and as harmless as doves, one can and should use Machiavelli's insights into how people truly behave in order to form the basis of a map of decision-making, but one should not thereby conclude from this that one should feed or manipulate people's baser instincts to control them. For while Machiavelli understands that the continuous use of power undermines the state, and lawlessness as a form of tyrannical rule engenders hatred of the prince and revolution to topple him, this force-centric approach only varies in degrees. For if you only appear to be good and never actually behave in a moral fashion, you are still the tyrant who rules arbitrarily. For a tyrant is just someone who rules arbitrarily. I guess in this case, he decides it better. Machiavelli assumes his ideal prince will be able to hide his true motives and actions. In time, though, this charade itself will fail. Furthermore, as stated above, one loses touch with reality in a web of schemes and falsehood that harms one's ability to make decisions in a rational way. This is a common error amongst scientists. They assume that the way things are ought to be uncritically embraced and used for one's own benefit, regardless of other considerations. This line of thinking is obviously fallacious. For example, why build houses? We should just accept that nature gives us without any alteration. Machiavelli was in many ways a quantum leap in our understanding of the science of power. But within the same century of that which is called the 16th, we find another, arguably even more revolutionary thinker, Étienne de la Boétie, and his Discourse on Voluntary Servitude, published in 1577. The central axiom of Boétie is this: all rulers, even tyrants, rule by an implicit consent of the people. He argues that when hundreds of thousands of people accept the chains of tyranny, it becomes harder to accept that fear of force alone holds them back, as collectively they have more total force than the tyrant and his entourage. Complacency is his answer. From this axiom follows the quantum leap in the science of power. In order to throw a tyrant off, you in fact don't have to do anything. As Boétie states, obviously there is no need of fighting to overcome this single tyrant, for he is automatically defeated if the country refuses consent to its own enslavement. It is not necessary to deprive him of anything, but simply to give him nothing. There is no need that the country make an effort to do anything for itself, provided it does nothing against itself. Another quote, I do not ask that you place hands upon the tyrant to topple him over, but simply that you support him no longer. Then you will behold him like a great colossus whose pedestal has been pulled away, fall of his own weight and break in pieces. This is earth-shattering. Any large organization, be it state, religious institutions, economic institutions, etc., the bureaucracy is made up of people. We can imagine a pyramid in which the top is the ruler, the middle is the bureaucracy, and the bottom the people. In each case, people must consent to his rule. If, for example, his generals and soldiers refuse to obey his orders, as happened in Russia in 1917 and 1991, then he can just pound salt for all it's worth. Rothbard saw this theory at work in the Velvet Revolutions that brought down the Eastern Bloc. Compliance and consent is powerful in that when given, the authorities are being given something of great value for free. They are not paying for it, they are expecting it. If you make them pay for it, you begin to eat away at their power. Fast forward to the present day and the political theories of John Locke, the Founding Fathers, and modern psychological warfare called ad campaigns show us how powerful consent is. It not only freely gives to the ruler something very valuable, but also transfers the karmic cost of action. If the purveyors of vice and criminality get you to freely choose the thing they want you to do, you bear more of the brunt of it than you were if you were coerced into it. Boétie discusses how a tyrant maintains consent. He does this in two ways, gifts and hierarchy. The allies of the tyrant are both enriched by the man and will therefore endure minor inconveniences from him in order to gain wealth and their ability to lord it over those who are beneath them in status. They may not be the biggest man, but they are bigger than most. Quote, still men accept servility in order to acquire wealth, as if they could acquire anything of their own when they cannot even assert that they belong to themselves, or as if anyone could possess under a tyrant a single thing in his own name. Yet they act as if their wealth really belonged to them and forget that it is they themselves who give the ruler the power to deprive everybody of everything, leaving nothing that anyone can identify as belonging to somebody. Another quote, such are his archers, his guards, his halberdiers, not that they themselves do not suffer occasionally at his hands, but this riff-raff, abandoned alike by God and man, can be led to endure evil if permitted to commit it, not against him who exploits them, but against those who like themselves submit but are helpless. Close quote. The essential takeaway here is that the real struggle and source of power is mental. It is, can you convince men to submit and work for you? As soon as these mental chains are broken, the power of the tyrant falls. This was further developed by Gene Sharp in his work on nonviolent resistance. This also aligns with the basic theory of guerrilla warfare, in which the mind of the enemy and the will of his leaders is a target of far more importance than the bodies of his troops. Boétie's theory is simple. It is all a negation. He is not calling people to action, but inaction. You don't have to rise up and slay the tyrant to win your freedom. All you have to do is stop giving support to the tyrant to win your freedom. If you are like the small snowflake that becomes the avalanche, then the tyrant will be doomed. Gene Sharp takes a more proactive approach and argues that people should organize mass movements to form a bottom-up base of resistance to the tyrant, while still agreeing with the insight of consent. That is a powerful tool, is shown by the Velvet Revolutions and the fall of the Eastern Bloc in the years 1989 to 1991. The next major revolution in understanding of the source of power is Joseph Tainter's On the Collapse of Complex Societies, published in 1988. Energy, something more fundamental than will or force, is the sea on which all action rests. His work is based on the concept of EROI, energy return on investment, which was originally pioneered by Charles A.S. Hall of the State University of New York, where he studied biological systems. If a predatory animal does not consume more energy in the kill than he does in the expenditure of the hunt, he will die. If the EROI is greater than 1-to-1, it is a source of energy. If the EROI is 1-to-1 or 1 to less than 1, we enter an energy sink, and it is no longer a valid source of energy. This means the animal will die. This process governs how action can take place in any given time. It does not matter if you have crack legions in Britain who can defeat any barbarian raid. If the empire does not have the energy to feed, clothe, equip, shelter, and pay you, it not only won't, but based on the laws of thermodynamics, it can't. Tainter argues that societies seek to form complex structures because they are more efficient. Think of the division of labor on an assembly line. These systems can do more work than if done by hand or by individuals. The downside is they are complex, fragile, and energy hungry. This leads to greater levels of energy consumption, which in turn drives expansion, but be it in the form of conquest, taxation, colonization, exploitation of resources, or innovation. In any case, the law of diminishing returns argues that the benefits of complexity will decline as the energy cost to maintain and expand them increases. This will lead to an energy sink and collapse, whereby a civilization moves from a high energy state to a low energy state. The process of collapse is catabolic in that it does not happen all at once, but in a controlled shutdown of least essential operations to most essential operations. Having looked at these three essential authors on the scientific understanding of power, Machiavelli, Boétie, and Tainter, a by no means exhaustive list, but illustrative of the main themes I wish to delve into, we can start describing power relations. While the order in which I discussed the aforementioned authors was chronological rather than from most fundamental force to least fundamental force, this delineation of power relations will begin in the fashion of most to least fundamental. This list will not include metaphysical forces, but just physical forces, as the goal is to describe the use of power by political or economic institutions. We start with energy, on which all thought and action are based. Energy is the most abstract and fundamental source of power. Then we move to specified abstract knowledge, which can be either philosophical, mathematics, scientific, or economic in nature. Knowledge is power and control. As Bertrand Russell states in Chapter 3 of The Scientific Outlook, more abstract than power and wealth you have over others. He gives an example of a man who knows all the details of his farm, a man who ships the goods produced by the farm on a railway, and the stock exchange operator who organizes the price and sale of the goods. The level of knowledge becomes increasingly more abstract, and as you climb the levels of abstraction, the man can acquire more wealth than those who lie below him. Russell then ends with science as an even more abstract and powerful system than a stock exchange. To quote Russell, the extreme abstractness of modern physics makes it difficult to understand, but gives to those who can understand it a grasp of the world as a whole, a sense of its structure and mechanism, which no less abstract apparatus could possibly supply. The power of using abstractions is the essence of intellect, and with every increase in abstraction, the intellect triumphs of science are enhanced. We then move to economic. Economic power is highly abstract and difficult to observe and describe. In fact, you were often discouraged from doing so. The crackdowns on labor in the 19th and 20th centuries were in part driven by the fear that too close observation and description of the material conditions of production and pay would unmask the system of exploitation and bring it down. Best not have the people see what is going on. The takeaway from Marx is that social relations are intentionally hidden by capital, and I might also add by technology, in order to confuse people as to the true relations of things. As the Bible states, the rich rules over the poor, and the borrower is servant to the lender. Benjamin Franklin in Poor Richard's Almanac, 1758, states, "Those have a short Lent, saith Poor Richard, who owe money to be paid at Easter. Then, since, as he says, the borrower is a slave to the lender, and the debtor to the creditor disdain the chain, preserve your freedom and maintain your independency. Be industrious and free, be frugal and free." The first mode of power and control is to indebt your people. This usually leads to revolutions, as the debt is never meant to be paid off, but to be the invisible chains of servitude. As I have spoken about before on many occasions, the inflation of the labor supply by empowering women and immigrants is a form of economic warfare to drive down the cost of labor so that labor can be paid less. In war making, as Julius Caesar stated, an army marches on its stomach. The realities of pay, equipment, food, and supplies are all economic questions. This is why, especially in modern times, a comparatively less martial and warlike civilization can defeat more warlike civilizations with a warrior tradition. The Roman, British, and American armies have all been logistics heavy and have greater staying power historically than their opponents. hence their ability to hold and conquer vast territories. Beginning in the 19th century and perfected in the 20th century is psychological warfare operations. The goal of this form of power is to attack directly the will of the opposition without the direct use of force. This can be done by many means. One could feed the opposition a steady stream of information that is suppressed by his own side, that undermines the trust he has in his own side. One could fabricate information for your own side or against his. One could make an internal critique in which you pit your opponent's views against himself, demonstrating a contradiction and forcing him to choose one of the two forks in the horns of a dilemma. The goal is to have sustained operations from which ever more varied and sophisticated actions arise out of. The cumulative effect is an irresistible force of mental energy that places a downward pressure on your opponent, such that he cannot even think. As thought precedes action, he will also be unable to act. This form of warfare is used in both military operations, such as the Vietnam War, but also in internal security, such as the Cultural War of the United States, which is one giant psyop between counter gangs in a frozen conflict. Lastly, we have force itself. The direct application of force is what most people think of when they think of power. This is most readily observable as a form of material expression of force. Much can be said and has been said about this form of power. The obvious downsides to this is that it is energy expensive. Only powerful states or corporations can raise and maintain large bodies of armed men. If that force is directed at non-combatants as a form of terror or just collateral damage, the potential media backlash would be crippling. Even when used against other combatants, the risk of defeat in battle is high. For example, Napoleon believed his empire could absorb the cost of the invasion of Russia. Otherwise, he wouldn't have attempted it. But in the long run, he was wrong. This invasion brought down his empire. In the use of force, we have two basic approaches, the direct and indirect. The German stormtrooper tactics on the Western Front show these two approaches. The stormtroopers would find and assault the weak points in the enemy line to encircle strong points and threaten the enemy lines of communication. The main army would then move up behind the assault troops and directly assault the fortified positions. Conversely, another example of this would be guerrilla warfare. Maoist forces in China began by attacking isolated nationalist and later Japanese units, harassing their lines of communication and mobilizing the peasantry. When victory was within reach in 1948, Mao transitioned his forces to conventional operations and engaged in direct force-on-force engagements with the nationalists, such as Huai Hai. We can also speak of attrition and maneuver. Attritional tactics are the use of superior maneuver resources to grind the enemy down and defeat. A classic example of this is Grant's overland campaign in 1864 and his siege of Richmond, Petersburg in 1864-65. Maneuver is the use of military forces to march around the enemy's strong points, turn enemy flanks, and defeat dispersed forces in detail before they can unify. A classic example of this strategy is Stonewall Jackson's Shenandoah Valley campaign of 1862. Since the Vietnam War, the primacy of the mental has begun to assert itself over the physical in the war, with the first scientific study of guerrilla warfare being Lawrence of Arabia in his Encyclopedia Britannica entry on the topic, followed up by Mao's writings on the subject. We are converging on a reality in which it is possible to win wars without winning battles. At the Paris Peace Accord in 1973, Kissinger told Lee Duc-Tho, "You never won any battles against the U.S., with Tho responding, "It doesn't matter, you are about to withdraw from Vietnam." A similar result occurred in Lebanon in 2000. Under pressure from Hamas, Hezbollah, Israel withdrew, and the defeat of U.S. forces in Afghanistan in 2021 by the Taliban. In all these cases, the force with superior force lost the war. This indicates a revolution in warfighting potential in which the use of force is not directed at enemy personnel as the main target, but merely as a means to an end, that of raising the moral and economic cost of war to such levels that the occupation forces withdraw. To summarize all of the above information, the scientific study of power begins with Machiavelli, with his big ideas being observe men as they are, mask your intentions with morality, power is rooted in force. Boétie argues that power is rooted in consent. From this, he argues that non-compliance and withdrawal of support is sufficient to bring down tyrants. Tainter argues that complex systems fall to the law of diminishing returns, creating energy sinks that lead to catabolic collapse, where systems within the political order are sacrificed to preserve energy from the least essential to the most. In this sense, in the sense of use by an organized body of men, power begins with the energy, the foundation for thought and action, the comprehension of abstract principles, the use of mental pressure to attack your opponent's mind without the use of force, the use of economic pressures, and lastly, the direct application of force to affect the mind of your opponent. All right. And we have in the chat, let's see, Salmon Fish. Okay, Corbin, hello. Seamus O'Brien, hello. Well, let's see here. Seamus O'Brien says, if employing women and immigrants leads to lower labor costs but increases the objective costs of energy, materials, and complexity, then this is a sign that the financial system must be built on a fundamentally warped logic and is perhaps ultra-entropic wasteful. Yes, that's what I've been driving at for a long time. That's a very good way to put it, Seamus O'Brien. Let's see. Yeah, well, everybody, this hopefully was an informative episode for you guys. Make sure to tune in on Thursday, where Florian and I will continue our discussions on the intersection of faith and science. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Fly podcast, signing off.